Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
Our next speaker is one who I know many of you throughout the Southeast and many other parts of the country know very well. And I'm sure that he too has a wonderful message for us. Many of us know this man for the work that he has done at Blackstone in Virginia. They do a wonderful job there. So at this time, I give you Tom L. from Virginia.
Thank you very much, Walter, and thank all of you. I find myself very often trying to make an excuse for the position I am usually placed in when I get involved in a program such as this. And the thing as big as the World International Conference, I was sitting here thinking a man's a fool to allow himself to be talked into speaking here to begin with. And I don't know why, invariably, those who have responsibility for programs always wind up sticking me behind the powerhouse that they brought in. But I know that you're in a good mood and you'll be charitable because Luann has done such a wonderful job. My name is Tom Lovern, and I'm an alcoholic. I happen to be a Methodist minister, but I am a part of the clergy because of AA, and I am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, thank God, this day in good standing because I need to belong to this. When I came in yesterday, and I'm sure there are a great many honored guests, and I know the girls at the registration desk were honoring them in such way, and I went over and handed mine in, and I suppose they saw the Reverend Thomas Lovern, and so they gave me a tag with my whole name on it. And I didn't even notice it until about dinner time somebody called me down for walking around with my full name on the tag. And I tried to decide whether it would be better to just be a part of that other group of civilians or be a part of you. So I went back and told the young lady at the desk that I earned the right to anonymity the hard way. Now, like every person in this room, I am grateful to be here and in this place today. I'm very grateful to those who have afforded me the privilege of sharing in this way this afternoon. I know how inadequate I am, and I'm just going to trust the same God who brought me to this fellowship a great many years ago to use whatever I might do here now. I was in this place 15 years ago, I think about 15 years ago, at a Southeastern conference, and I was brought by my sponsor. Bless his heart, he, I am sure, is here today, though he looks down from a celestial group. And I'm grateful that I'm here today in the same sort of standing in the fellowship with my sponsor of today. And Julian is here, and I know that whatever I do, right or wrong, I'm going to hear about it just as soon as I get through. But I do want to correct one bit of misinformation, so allow me just a minute or two to do it. There are some vicious stories going about the country about me, and I have not been drunk. That's the only way I could change my story, and I don't plan to change it if I can help it. About a year ago, I got a call from some fine folks in the fellowship up in Montreal, and they said, could you come up next month to a conference? And I said, no, there's nothing I'd rather do than this, but I just can't come. And he said, well, could we get you another time? And I said, well, if you'd be so kind, I'd love to come another time. So we chatted a bit, and he promised a rain check, and I hung up. A couple of days later, I got a telephone call from Canada, and the fellow said, Tom, I know it's way ahead of time, but could you come to our conference next year? Well, the bell rung. I thought Montreal called me back. So I promised I would, and we set up the dates, and I said, if the good Lord keeps us all around, I'll come next year. So for a year, I was walking about saying we're going to Montreal next year to the conference. Well, in May, Gay and I went to Canada. Now, like AAs, we don't write much, we telephone. And they told me this conference was being held at a place called Thunder Bay. Now, you see, you don't know where it is any more than I did. So we made our arrangements, and Gay and I left, and we spent a night in upper New York State and crossed the border into Canada, and were thoroughly enjoying going up the Queens Highway to Montreal. And Gay said to me, and bless her heart, she's spent a lot of years trying to keep me in the right direction. She said, "Do you know exactly where Thunder Bay is?" I said, "No, it must be near Montreal." So we rode along, and she questioned me again. And I said, "Gay, for goodness sake, I talked to the man. I know where we are going." She said, "Well, I was just reading this pamphlet. This conference is in Ontario, and I think Montreal is in Quebec." And the first light turned on. And I didn't want her to know that I was even fearful that I was wrong. So we pulled into a filling station, and I said something to the fellow about Thunder Bay, and why, he said yes, he knew where it was. And he took out a road map. And he said, "You're down here," and he went across the map and turned it over. And 60 miles from Montreal, I found out we were 925 miles from Thunder Bay. Fortunately, we were 2 days ahead of time, and we just made it. Now, my sponsor, Julian, had not planned to come here in May. And when I got home, he and Julie began making plans to come to Miami. And he said, "I'm just going to make sure you don't get lost on the way down." You find yourself, after so many years, and I hasten to tell you, I have been around AA for 24 years. I have been in AA for 21 years. And after so many years, having such a privilege as this, you find yourself again and again wondering, what do you say to people? And as all of you who have had the experience, even in the local groups, as is my experience, you know that after such contemplation, you come back again to the only answer there is. You don't have anything more to say except what has been so beautifully said here, what it was like, what happened, and what's happening to you now. I am reminded, and I've told the story many times, it's a little story that came out of our family, and we love it ourselves. Being a minister, we live in a parsonage. And some years ago, we were serving a church down in eastern Virginia along the James River Valley, and the parsonage was next door to the church. And on Sunday morning, we went through a rather hectic hour trying to get our family ready and over to the front door of the church before the parishioners began to arrive. It just doesn't do for the minister's family to be late by even one parishioner on Sunday morning if you live that close. And we have 4 sons and have been so greatly blessed in these 4 men. And this day, our boys were not as old as now, of course, and there was T.Y., our oldest son, and then twin boys, David and Danny, and then the little fellow, Mike. Mike was a late arrival in our lives and had become somewhat the joy of the entire family, but somewhat the hellion, too. And on this particular Sunday morning, we were busily engaged in this business of getting ready to get to the church ahead of the parishioners. And our boys, being no girls were in the house, had been taught to do some housework. And they were each responsible for caring for their own rooms. Now, the oldest boy was at the age where responsibility had meaning, and there was no problem with him. The twin boys were a little younger, and they took a bit of guidance. They tried hard, though, but they had each other to help. Mike, the little fellow, had a strange idea of cleanliness. If you couldn't see it, it was clean with Mike. And on this particular morning, he had more or less stuck things under his bed in his room, as much as he was able to do, and he'd gone into the twins' room to watch them painstakingly make their beds. And he stood, I guess, contemplating the whole scene and wondering what he could do to disrupt it. And he watched them, and when they got everything done just right, he just couldn't stand such orderliness. He walked over and stood between the twin beds, and at one fell swoop he pulled the spreads from the bed and stood back and looked at the twin brothers. And of course they had things to say with him. He bawled one out, kicked the other one on the shin, threw an old cat out of the chair, and came down the steps angelically singing, "Yes, Jesus loves me." And I told Gay, I said, "You know, I wonder." Like I wonder what to say. I don't really wonder what to say. I have a story, like we all have. Mine is a story of darkness. It's a story of a feeble light fanned by prayers and love and compassion and understanding. But best of all, it's a story today of the great brightness of God's love and mercy for us in the Lovern household. There's no necessity for me to go back and tell you a great deal about the days of drinking and alcoholism that brought me to the need of AA. The story is not unlike the story hundreds of you could tell. I think there is a necessity for me, and I have been doing it for a great many years, to tell you a bit of the story of darkness, for part of my darkness was lived about the fellowship of AA. And perhaps it is the period in my life of which I am least proud. Because like Luann and all of you, I've come to love this fellowship in such a way that if I allow myself to think too long about the hours and days and times that I misused it and mistreated and conned it or thought I was conning you time and time again, that's the time that I hurt the hardest inside. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous the first time not because I wanted to be here at all. I was then working as a field engineer for one of the major insurance groups, and Gay and I were living with our then one son in Chattanooga. And I traveled a great deal, and I knew that today that my life was totally out of control in those days, and yet I was not able to see or to comprehend this. Gay had long before this already begun to understand, as had a great many friends and loved ones about our family. And on this particular occasion, I was up in Nashville, Tennessee, and for some strange reason, it was about Wednesday or middle of the week, I had not been drinking early in the week. Even alcoholics have enough sense left through a period of time to know that occasionally you've got to work if you're going to make it. You don't like it at all, but sometimes you have to, and I had on that week been making up for the weeks I had not been working. But on the evening of the middle of the week, I called Gay in Chattanooga, and I told her that I remembered that the weekend was to mark our anniversary, and that I had not forgotten so important a day in our lives, and if she and the boy would be ready on Friday, I'd finish up my work, and we'd hurry on in home, and the three of us would go away or do something very special for the weekend to celebrate the anniversary of our marriage. And I know that I made Gay very happy on that particular evening, one, because I called up not drinking. Now, I don't know about you fellas, my wife could smell liquor 300 miles over the telephone. And secondly, I think she was quite happy because I had remembered an important time, and I was about at that stage of alcoholism when days of importance were no longer important to me. And we chatted a bit here, and I hung up, leaving her rather radiant, and I sat there in the hotel room and thought, now you've been really taking yourself to task, Tom, about this drinking and your problem. And here is just proof for you that things are not nearly as bad as you think they might be. You remembered this important day, and here you are sober, and you've been working hard for 3 days. I've done about 3 weeks' work in 3 days, is what and you're entitled to a drink. And I had a drink. And I got home Friday of the following week. Now, I went through my first prolonged blackout. I went 5 days without memory. I later learned that I had been down to Memphis and over to Mobile and back to Nashville and was in a different hotel when I came out of the blackout. And it was Friday morning. And I was horrified to learn that I had missed the whole bit by a whole week. And I got myself together and started driving to Chattanooga trying to think of another lie to tell. And I shall never forget, all the way home, one lie after another had to be discarded because it was either too weak for the moment or had already been used. And finally, this arrogance of the alcoholic began to come out. And I began to think to myself, why should I be concerned about whether or not they believe me? I mean, after all, it's my house they're living in, it's my money they're living on, and I work hard for this. I've been working real hard for 10 days. I've been blacked out somewhere. And so I got to Chattanooga and I got to the apartment, and I did get myself sort of steeled for what was going to happen. And I opened the door and braced myself, and instead of what I expected, there was absolute silence. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Gay was sitting there looking at me. When you're expecting one thing and silence is all you find, this is horrible. And before I could start an explanation, she said, your boss said, when and if you came home, you were not to make a move without calling him. And I went on back towards the office that we were keeping in the apartment, thinking to myself, now this woman's ruined everything. She's been talking with my employer, and she's probably told him all about me, and he's going to fire me. And I thought, I'm not going to put up with this. So I called him, and I frantically tried to think of a lie to tell him, and I couldn't think of another one either. Now, it was not by plan at all. I purely stumbled into one of the greatest truths I've ever learned. When he came on the phone, I said, Lee, this is Tom. He said, yeah. He said, where have you been? We have looked all over the territory. We have been frantic. Gay and I have talked and talked. We've called friends. We've called agents. We've called plants. We've checked hospitals and jails. Where have you been? And here's where this great truth came out. Suddenly I said, Lee, you know, in all the years I've worked for you, I've never lied to you. I have been drunk for 10 days, and I left him speechless. And the thing dawned on me, you know how to handle people? You hit them with the truth, and nobody knows what to do with it. And I was feeling a great sense of power all of a sudden, and he said, have you ever heard of Alcoholics Anonymous? And after a while I said, yes, I've heard of it. Well, I read about it. Our house was papered with reprints of the Jack Alexander article. Gay had long ago found out what was wrong in our home. And then the only way she knew how to do this, she had been putting these little reprints from the Saturday Evening Post article all over the house. The bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, it didn't matter when, there they were. And I had read one of them in kind of self-defense. And I remember that she asked me after I read it what I thought of it. I said, you know, that's a very interesting thing. Do we know anybody that needs it? And my boss stole away my power real fast. He said, in the courses of Gay's and my conversation, We have also found out that there is an AA group in Chattanooga. Now, this is 24 years ago. And we found out who belongs to it, and there's a nice man and his wife going to come by and take you tonight. And if you want to be working for me Monday morning, you better go with them. And I hung up, and there wasn't a word spoken, but I saw it written all over the place. Gay was saying to me with finality, and big boy, if you want me here to send you to work Monday morning, you're going with them. And I went to my first AA meeting that Friday night. I didn't want anything you had. I resented you. You had interrupted my life. You had brought some sort of theology or philosophy into my household uninvited. I wanted nothing to do with what you had. There just wasn't anything you could have to tell me that would interest me. And I went and I got in a corner and I made up my mind I wasn't going to speak to anybody there. Well, they didn't speak to me either. I do remember two things. I remember that there were about 10 or 11 people present. And when we finished the meeting, the building had been locked up, and we went down the fire stairs and out through a little parking lot in the back. And my car wasn't, I wouldn't even drive my car in downtown Chattanooga if that group was meeting on Friday night. I didn't want anybody to think I was down there with you. And I went down, and I stood in that lot, and I watched. I can't remember exactly. I think there were 3 Cadillacs and a Lincoln drove out of that with about 11 people. And I'd just been upstairs listening to them talk about jail and hospitals and asylums and lost jobs and lost families and bankruptcies. And I watched those cars, and I thought to myself, I have either found myself with the biggest bunch of liars in the world, or these people got something going for them that nobody knows about. Now, I went to AA only when I had to, because as an alcoholic, I loved my wife and children as much as an alcoholic is capable of loving anything. I had an appreciation for my employment because it gave me a sense of belonging and a sense of some achievement, and I didn't want to lose that. I could extend my traveling so that I wasn't home as often and thus did not have to go to as many meetings. And I went occasionally because it kept peace in the whole place, and I know today that I wasn't fooling Gay at all, and yet it was the only hope we had left. And she was just going to let me go on for a while, hoping that one night somebody would say something, and it almost backfired on her, because soon after this somebody said something one night, and because I had to do everything the back door way, I had to pervert what was said in AA. It dawned on me sitting in one of those early meetings one night, I was beginning to listen to a little, that I had found out why I drank, and this was reason enough for being there. I drank because I was sick. And I liked this. I had been much worried about my drinking. And now knowing that I drank because I couldn't help it was the greatest relief in the world. And I could stop Gay right in her tracks. I could come in 3 or 4 days late off a road trip and meet her right in the living room of an apartment, and before she could say a word, I'd say, now you just wait a minute, Gay. It seems to me, I'd say, you are never going to understand what they've been telling you down at AA. I can't help this. I'm sick. And I'd tell her, don't get me upset. They say that's the worst thing you can do. Some years later, Gay came home from the doctor's one day, and she was all smiles, and she announced to the family, she said, I've been waiting for years for this. My doctor said for me to tell the whole crowd of you, don't get me upset. That's the worst thing you could do. And I understood her moment of glory in this. Well, you know what happened. Somehow, I guess we fooled my employer. In a matter of some months, we got a fine promotion, and I was sent to the city of New Orleans as supervising engineer for the entire Gulf Coast area for my company. I think the youngest man who had ever held such a position in the company I worked for, and I found a new degree of pride. We moved into New Orleans on Mardi Gras Day, and we were living with somebody else paying all the expenses at the Hotel Roosevelt. And on the 4th of July of the same year, I was sitting on a bench in Jackson Square down in the midst of the Vieux Carré, with my wife and child gone, and my job gone, my self-respect gone, and hating me as few men could hate anything. Alcoholism doesn't take too long. And two men came in the square and sat down, one on either side of the bench, and they asked me how I was. It's a stupid question. I'm dead. And I knew quickly who they were from, though my first thought they're police or something else. They were from AA. And they came on a holiday to look for Tom Lovern. Because back up in Chattanooga, there was a little man that believed in this program. And he couldn't rest with himself without periodically calling some friends in New Orleans and begging them to keep close. And up in Virginia, there was this woman God had given me as a wife. She had to be barred from the host of the angels of heaven, and certainly as my lend-lease from God, and she could not stop praying and loving me enough to keep begging somebody in New Orleans to talk to Tom once in a while. He might get ready. And they came. They used their holiday to look for me. And for the first time in my life, I listened to what some AAs had to say. They told me I didn't have to be this way. I'd heard it before and yet had not heard it. They told me the first words about God caring about somebody like me. I couldn't quite believe this. But in a matter of a few weeks, I was back in Virginia. I had other employment through the good graces of new AA friends. We had our home and family restored, and within a month after we came to Virginia, we had the twin boys born. I'll never forget the day the doctor walked out in the waiting room at the hospital, and he said to her, well, it was a month after Gay had left, and I'd just been there 3 days. He walked out and he said, congratulations, Mr. Lovern, you have twin sons. Well, it was a marvelous thing today, I know, but at the moment all I could think of, this guy's congratulating me. I am without a job. I am broke. There are some bad checks bouncing around in Louisiana and Mississippi. I'm scared to answer the telephone. I'm afraid for somebody to knock on the door of my parents' home. This is where we were. And he's telling me how lucky I am. I went into AA in Virginia because my newfound friends in New Orleans had said to me I was not going to make it unless I got myself immersed. Now, I found some people in the group up in Richmond, and I sat with them, and I told them how badly I wanted not to drink and how desperately I needed the program of AA, and I loved everything about it. I said, but there is this business about God, and this disturbs me. What I was trying to say to those men I know today is that I'm so ashamed inside of my own misuse of the heritage of man that I'm afraid to face God. And so I'm telling them I won't buy the God business. And I was told by those men, I'm sure thinking they were doing the wise thing, was told the biggest lie I've ever been told in my life, in or out of AA. They said to me, Tom, this is all right, you really got no worries at all about this. You just take out of this program what you want. And the rest you throw out the window. Just forget it if it bothers you. And I spent the next 2.5 years crawling around outside the window looking for all I threw out. I thought on the night I was told this is not a bad program. I went home and I took my 12 steps, and step 1, no problem. I had already begun to admit to anybody that would listen that I was an alcoholic. Had not accepted it, but I didn't know it then. And it would be so nice to say that I came off a park bench in New Orleans and everything just went beautifully. No, it took 2.5 more years. Now, I never had a slip. I was drunk 5 times in the 2.5 years. I just don't believe in the philosophy of slips. I don't know how you slip off of something you ain't got. And of course, I had a one-step program. You throw everything that pertains to God out of the 12 steps, and you wind up with one. And it was inevitable that I get drunk. But I went back to AA. I didn't have anywhere else to go. And I got me a new set of sponsors, and I said to this new group, that other crowd told me wrong. And I told them, well, they said, well, they shouldn't have been quite so emphatic about this, Tom. There are other things in AA that help. Now, this group they were hung up on group therapy. And they convinced me that group therapy was the answer. So they said, if there's that about the AA program you don't like or can't use, let's just let the group therapy keep you sober. Now, as therapeuticized as few people have been therapeuticized in AA. And I just might have made it if my therapist had stayed sober. But they didn't have any more AA than I did, and we all got drunk. And I came back to AA, and I had 5 sets of sponsors during that period. And I got my new set, and they told me that I didn't seem to want to assume any responsibility. Now, they were nearer right than anybody knows. I decided, well, if responsibility, I ought to be doing something for AA. Now, it didn't occur to me to get sober and find a message and go find somebody to impart it to. My idea of responsibility at this stage was doing something physical for AA. We owned property in those days in Richmond, and we had a business meeting every quarter, and you had to stay sober 90 days to vote. And we voted on everything. And this was involved in the growing pains of the fellowship out in the hinterlands, and I decided responsibility means I must be responsible in these physical matters. So I embarked on my scale of sobriety, and the business meeting came, and I sat that night and voted on everything they voted on, and also watched them elect 2 or 3 guys to the board of managers, and I found out this was done too after you'd been sober 12 months, and I extended my sobriety to 12 months because I wanted to help run that club. And I quietly politicked, and I got elected. And I went to my first manager's meeting and expressed myself in no uncertain terms about how wrong they'd been, and got drunk on the way home from the manager. But now, to draw this phase of darkness to a close, unbeknown to Tom Lovern, some strange things were happening. Despite my avowal not to hear everything that was said, I was hearing. And despite my personal animosity towards a great many people because they were what I wanted to be. I used to hear a fellow get up and say, my name is so-and-so, and I've been sober 7 years and 4 months and 2 weeks and 3 days, and I hated him. Because I hadn't been sober 3 days usually. And I went through this last phase. And in it, I found out I didn't like me. 3 years after my introduction to AA, I took my first personal inventory. And it was a horrifying experience. I almost quit numerous times because I didn't like what I was finding. I couldn't find enough good in the whole of me to offset the slightest iota of that was bad. If my life were a balance, it'd be one way for sure. And the only good thing I could find is that I did know about AA. And also I'd found now that I had begun to notice some people in this fellowship, people that were a little different, people that were well, it was the thing that seemed to show wherever they are. You can get them in a group. I can go out here in this lobby, and I can get in any crowd here, and there's some 1 or 2 or 3 people standing there that there's a sort of radiation from. My friend Walter on the West Coast says the look in their eyes. We've called it serenity. We've called the peace of the soul. And among those in my group, I had been unknowingly watching some of these. It might have been the little guy at your home group that comes early and puts up the chairs and sets out the ashtrays. And when everybody's gone home laughingly happy, he stays by himself to clean up. Nobody ever calls him by name. But he's got something. And I found another strange thing because I began to talk to a few of these people, and one in particular, the man who really became my legitimate sponsor in AA. And I beg no anonymity. He's passed on, Jack White, the first AA in the state of Virginia. I went to Jack and I said to him, Jack, I've made a horrible mess of this whole thing, and I desperately need help, and I don't think I've really ever asked anybody for help before. Will you help me? And I'll never forget that old man as long as I live. Profane when one would even dare to misuse the first shred of this program, and yet saintly in his bearing, and compassionate and tender to a fault in the handling of an alcoholic. And that dear old man knew that I sat in his office hurting worse than any drunk I had ever been on, because sober hurt for the alcoholic is even worse than drunk hurt. And I said to him, I suddenly realized I don't know anything about this. And I don't like me anymore. I want to be what I am, and I don't know whether I can make it or not. The dear old man said, I've been watching you. I was kind of hoping you'd come around someday and ask me if I'd share with you. And I'll just be happy to. But he said, I want you to know something first of all about sponsorship. If I'm going to be your sponsor, you're either going to listen to me when you need to listen, and you're going to share with me when you need to share, or we're going to sever this relationship right then and there. And I agreed to this. And we talked over and over and over again about the things that were wrong in my life, and I was able to go back and for the first time tell this man that it wasn't that I didn't believe in God. I had believed in a divine power all of my life. I just believed that I'd forfeited my right to whatever power or heritage there was of divinity for man. And my sponsor began to show me differently from this, and I told him that we talked about prayer and meditation, and I didn't know how to pray, and I just didn't believe anybody knew how. And that dear old man told me about his learning to pray. He told me about being in Keeley Institute in Greensboro years before, and this dear old man was twice my age. and up in his 50s. One night a nurse said to him, "Mr. White, you've tried everything in the world. You've been to this place until they don't even want you to come anymore. They think you're giving the sanatorium a bad name." "Have you ever tried to pray?" And he said to this nurse, "I don't know how to pray." She said, "You must know something about prayer." He said, "I remember something, I think, like, 'Now lay me down to sleep.' And she said, "If you try that, that's all you got. I think it'll work." And he sat in his office and told me about getting out of the bed in that sanatorium by himself in the cold of night and getting on his knees. A man in his mid-50s praying, "Now lay me down to sleep," because it's the only prayer he knew. And he never had a drink from that night till the day he died. And I told him that I didn't know how to find God. And he began to unfold the ways for me. Now, they didn't just stop with those sessions in his office. This sponsor began to teach me the sort of things that keep me living today. Let me tell you quickly of a couple of places I've found God so unexpectedly. You know, God need not be a problem for us. We complicate it. God's simplicity itself, if we let it be. My sponsor began to teach me to look for God in the common, ordinary, everyday places of life. I already knew that I couldn't find God in the maze of the theology of my church. And today as a minister, I pray constantly, "Oh God, don't let me be guilty of creating a veil before God for men. Don't let me get caught up in the institution of the church. Don't let me get caught up in the theology of the church in such a way that men can't find God through the thing I proclaim." I love to duck hunt. And I had already been in the ministry about 5 years. And I must confess to you today, I was still not finding God in the ways I wanted to. There was still this tiny barrier between me and God. As I felt a sense of service to God now. I was sober, I was happy, but there was something needed. I guess I was still trying to complicate God. And on this particular morning in the church we were serving, I had a member who was a forester, and he found about my love for duck hunting, and the duck season opened, and he came over early in the season before daylight one morning and picked me up in his truck, and we went down into the Chickahominy swamps of eastern Virginia to go duck hunting. We drove in his truck as far as we could go, and we got out and we walked for quite a distance, and finally we came on a stream of water, and it was pitch black in that place, and I just followed along in his footsteps. I remember thinking then how marvelous it is to go with somebody that knows the way. We got in a boat, and we motored on around through that swamp, and I could not have guided anybody anywhere in it, but he knew surely where we were going, and I saw all sorts of shadows and fearful-looking things. It was rather frightening. We finally crossed an open body of water, and we got in the duck blind after putting the boat away, and we whispered together for a little while. It was that kind of surroundings. You just didn't want to talk in a loud voice, and after a bit, we didn't even talk to each other, and as we were standing there in the silence of that place, me still looking at the fearful and imaginary shadows all about me, darkness, that's what it was. Way over here, I heard the first timid chirp of a bird, and over here I heard one answer. And I stood in that place, and it seemed to me that it happened almost in the twinkling of an eye, but I know it must have taken minutes. That whole world come awake in those swamps, and it seemed almost suddenly the sun came up over those great cypress trees, and what seemed so dark and fearful suddenly became a place of great light and beauty. My friend was a very wise man. I think he knew I was having some sort of spiritual awakening. We didn't fire a gun that morning and could have.
After a while, we left that place, and I got home and went over in the church by myself and sat and thought about this, and suddenly I could hear my sponsor. I could hear the psalmist of old saying, once I was blind, and now I see. I thought, oh God, this is exactly what he was trying to say. Just turn it loose. It's just all right. That's the way it began to open up for me, because of this man caring enough to be my sponsor. Sometime later in that same church, that came on a Palm Sunday afternoon to our parsonage, a lovely young woman. And she asked me if I would go and see her husband. She said he'd been in bed drunk 5 days. And of course I said I'd go, and because of it being the day it was and the busy times ahead for evening arrangements at the church, it was agreed that I'd drive my car and follow her to her home so I could get back. And as I went up the road, I began to forget for a minute or two. And the thoughts began to come in. It's Palm Sunday. This drunk ought to have known this. Well, what drunk cares what Sunday it is? Why couldn't he have gotten ready last Sunday or waited till Monday? Well, I have an obligation. I know what he needs. I'm going to give him the little canned speech right quick, and if he's interested, I'll come back tomorrow. I hope I never go again with a canned speech. And I tell you, some of us ought to look at these speeches. Some of them have been canned so long they're spoiled. We got to the house, and she ushered me in and up the stairs, and she opened the bedroom door, and I walked into the door and forgot everything I was going to say to this guy. She had neglected to tell me he was a hopeless cripple. He lay in his bed, and against the foot of the bed were a couple of cruel metal contraptions with which he didn't walk, but somehow dragged himself about. And I couldn't think of a thing to say to him. And I went across the room, and when I got to the bed, this poor devil looked at me and said, "Why did you come?" Well, I could have said, "Well, didn't you ask me to come?" But Tom Lovern didn't say anything. I heard my lips say to this man the words my sponsor had said to me. I said, "Because I love you." I'd never seen him before. It was the first time in my life I'd ever been able to tell a man I loved him. In a little while, we had him on the way to a hospital in Richmond. He was badly dehydrated and much in need of medical attention. I stayed in touch by phone, and the agreement was that when he came home, we were going to spend lots of time together, and we'd work this problem out. And a couple of Sundays later, I was already in the pulpit of the church, and we were singing the opening hymn of the service, and much to my surprise, into the back of the church came this fellow painfully and noisily making his way with his lovely wife by his side, and they got in the back, and he was helped into a back pew. And I forgot myself again. It was the day of Holy Communion, and I don't have the privilege of preaching on that day, and I was thinking, why couldn't he have come next Sunday? I could have said so much to him. We went on through with the service, and finally we were giving the invitation to Holy Communion. In our church, people come and kneel about the altar. And during this portion of the service, I was conscious that he had gotten out of the pew with help, and I thought it's been too long for him, and he's leaving. I'll go and see him this afternoon. No, he came down the center aisle of the church on those metal things. And he got to the altar of the church, and he couldn't kneel. But he stood there propped, and his wife kneeling beside him. And I finally got down to him, and I reached out to offer him the elements of the sacrament, and this man looked at me and said, "And I love you. I'll never stand any closer to God than I stood that moment." He's never had a drink. He has spent 14 years going in his wheelchair and on his crutches to the hospitals and places and helping crippled alcoholics. You just find God where you don't expect Him. You don't have to complicate it. I remember when we took our oldest son away from home to school. When the firstborn leaves the nest, it's not a happy time. We were living that year over in Clearwater, and I went up in Ohio with our boy to get him started in school, and I stayed a couple of days with him, and on a morning I got up to leave in a little before daylight, and somehow I seemed to have my greatest experiences in the dark of dawn, and I was standing in the room with this boy. Now, this boy remembered all about me. And I know that over the years, my being a part of the ministry and the love in our home and the hopes we'd shared with the children, that he had grown to respect me, and I guess there was a degree of pride, but somehow in these years there still was this little barrier here. We didn't have a father-son relationship like I wanted. Maybe I hadn't been able to tell him how much I loved him, and I stood there in the darkness of the room that morning, and I had this great urge to go over and put my arms around this boy and perhaps kiss his cheek and tell him how sorry I was for what had happened early in his life and how proud I was of him. Maybe it's because he's bigger than me and I was embarrassed. I hesitated. And while I hesitated, suddenly it was like all of it went away. He walked across the room and he put his arms around me and he kissed my cheek. And he told me how proud he was of me, his father. You can't stand any closer to God than this. I will never be closer to God than that moment. This is what my sponsor had been trying to tell me. And finally, one other moment that might have meaning for you. Not too long ago, this lovely woman, my wife, was in a hospital, and she'd had a not too serious, but a very painful operation. And she had not recovered. There was a great deal of hemorrhaging from the nose and mouth. The operation had been in the sinus passages and up above. And I went in one afternoon, and the doctor was busily stirring about as I got there, and I found out in a few moments that they had discovered a pretty good-sized blood clot above Gay's eyes, and he was making arrangements to immediately go in and get this out. And I was made to understand that this was a terribly dangerous thing, that if it were not caught quickly, that if it got away, that it could mean her life. But more, he told me that he was not going to be able to give her any anesthetic, that he just couldn't do it. And she was very upset, and she had reason to be. And I went out the back of the hospital, and it sat at the foot of Mill Mountain over in Roanoke, Virginia, and I went up in the pine trees behind the hospital, and I thought to myself, look, you pray about everything in the world. Now, I don't think God minds you asking once more for yourself and her, and I'm not sure how I prayed. I probably was very demanding of God up there. I probably said to him, look, God, Gay and I have asked you for a lot for other people. We don't ask you for much more for ourselves. You've been more than good, but I've got to ask you now. And if your promises are real, this woman can't stand anymore, and you've got to help her. And I went back down, and I held her in my arms a little bit, and I came and put her on the table and took her away, and I walked down the hall and up and down a bit, and finally was lighting about the second or third cigarette and wondering how long will it be, and suddenly the elevator doors opened. She came rolling back, and she was propped up on the stretcher. It had been a whole of 20 minutes. And I walked down to meet her, and she was smiling, and she said, he said I could go home tomorrow. And he followed down, and he came in a room the doctor did, and he picked things up, and he'd lay them down, and he'd look at her and look at me, and he turned around to me, and he said, Reverend Lovern, I don't make this kind of mistake. We couldn't find any blood clot. I've heard the word coincidence used. It doesn't even exist. You can't stand any closer to God than this. And his promises are as real as my sponsor told me they were. And finally, and it'll take me only a moment, it's not only a story of darkness and a story of a flickering light that was fanned to brightness because of AA, but it's the story of my sponsors. Jack, who passed away and left me feeling so alone. And I had somebody ask me since I've been here if after 21 years I still felt the need of sponsorship more than ever. More than ever. More than I am on more dangerous ground without a sponsor than I've been since the first day I decided I wanted to belong to this. When Jack passed away, I went down and found Dutch Whitley. Again, I break no anonymity. He's passed away. And a great many of you knew this Dutchman, a Methodist preacher like me. And he became my sponsor. And I lost Dutch. And I met Julian in this place 15 years ago, and I went to Julian and asked him to be my sponsor. This is a story of quickly what 3 sponsors have given me. I spent the last day of his life with Jack. Some of you in this room were over in Virginia those years ago at our state conference when Jack was dying of cancer. He sat in a chair for 3 or 4 days and nights refusing to be put to bed, because he was determined to see those of you who came to Richmond to the conference before he died. And he knew that if he lay down, he was going to die. And I got a call on this morning during the weekend of the conference, and they asked me to come to the hospital as quickly as I could. And I said, is he worse? They said, no worse. But the doctor wants you to come. And I went up to the hospital, and Jack was sitting there with a robe on over his pajamas, and his doctor said he wants to go out and ride around the city. And I looked with a question, I'm sure, and he said it can't possibly hurt him. Let him go. We put him in his car downstairs and asked him where he wanted to go, and the first place he carried me had us take him was out on the edge of town near the city dump, and there was a little tiny house, not much more than a tall paper shack. And we went and stopped there, and he said, go in and call out that man. And I went in, and there came out one of those old white-haired, genteel Negro men. And he came over and spoke to Jack, and Jack took him by the hand and thanked him for keeping his yard so beautiful all these years. He had taken care of Jack's yard, keeping it beautiful and giving him enjoyment, and told him goodbye. I went by a filling station that took care of his car and parked it for him every day when he went to business, and he wanted to thank the boys there for making life a little easier for him, and told them goodbye. Went in the alley behind his place of business, and he called his 9 employees out and told them there in that alley that the business they'd find was theirs. He'd given it to them. And thanked them for making life successful for him, and told them goodbye. And carried him back to his hospital room, and he got in bed. And let me tell you what he told me. He thanked me for letting him love me. That sponsor taught me the meaning of love. And Dutch, I sat with Dutch's wife and children in a mortician's office on the day of his death. And he was filling out all the papers. And he said to him, "Could you give me this information, please? What was his mother and father's name?" And we looked at each other blankly. We didn't know. "What was his full name?" And we had to say, "You'll have to make a notation by this. By an act of the courts, his name was Leon E. Whitley." You see, he had jumped ship in America at the age of 14, an Austrian orphan who didn't even know who he was. He had educated himself. When he was found as an alien in this country, he was teaching flying to the Coast Guard as a civilian instructor. By an act of Congress, he was made a citizen of the United States, though later he went through the process of naturalization because he wanted to be like other Americans who so gained their citizenship. He had accomplished things beyond the wildest dreams of men in his life. And yet he had become a Methodist preacher and had always insisted on having the appointments in churches nobody else wanted because he felt he owed God so much. And he'd given me a kind of brotherhood because I have no blood brothers. And I thought that day in that mortician's office how very sad to bury a friend and not even really know who he is. And 2 days later I stood at the open crypt, for Dutch had no other family, and he was buried in Gaze in my crypt. And I stood there, and suddenly I thought how totally unimportant to know who he was. I know what he was. How very important. Dutch taught me that who we are means nothing. It's what we are as members of this fellowship before God and in the sight of men that's all important. And finally, my present sponsor, I owe him as much. I love this man because he keeps me reminded of my responsibility. I don't know of a man in AA anywhere that's more conscious of the responsibility of the member of the fellowship to what we have and what we've been given. And in no uncertain terms he'll tell me, it doesn't matter whether I'm a preacher or not. And I hear a lot of unpreacher-like language when I get out of line. And I appreciate being taught and sponsored in my responsibility because I've got 4 sons. And I've got 4 little grandsons today, and I pray God not a one of them will ever need to be here. I don't want them to pay the price. But, oh God, if they should need to come here, don't let it be any less than I had. And that's my responsibility. And it's yours. My relationship and regard for you has not changed. I still never begin a day of my life that I don't stop and thank God for AA all over the world. For you see, I know without you I wouldn't be having a new day. And I never end a day of my life that I don't stop and pray for a moment of prayer of thanksgiving for AA, for all of you, and for AA everywhere, because without you I wouldn't have had the day. And they're not all good days. But I'm even more thankful because you've taught me that God forgives. And I never go into the pulpit of my church that I don't stop for a moment at the altar and kneel. And if it has any meaning for you, I'll share a second or two of prayer with you every Sunday morning at the 11 o'clock hour. I stop there and thank God, not as a part of the ritual of the church or to meet the requirements of our creed or order of worship, but it's my personal moment to kneel and thank God for AA and to ask His special blessing for you that day, for without you, I wouldn't have this privilege. And I can't go into my home, I don't care how many times a day, and see this angelic woman these sons and the girls they've brought to be a part of our family, and these 7 beautiful little grandchildren that are ours, without stopping with a lump in my throat and a tightening of the heartstrings, and thanking God for AA and for all of you. These are my most precious possessions, and without you I would have lost them. And I thank God for AA and for all of you here today for letting me spend a little time looking once again into the soul and life of Tom Lovern. Thank you, and God bless you.